I wasn't even supposed to be there that day. My cousin Priya TBH had been visiting from Edinburgh, and she'd been going on about wanting to see the changing of the guard since she arrived. 3 days she'd been asking. 3 days I'd made excuses. Too cold. Plus, too crowded. Too much standing around waiting for something that takes 45 minutes to set up and 12 minutes to actually happen. But, that Tuesday morning in early June, she wore me down. We got the tube from Paddington, came up at St. James's Park Station, and, by the time we reached the gate on Birdcage Walk, there was already a crowd 2 or 3 people deep pressed against the railings. I think, tourists mostly. A few school groups in matching lanyards. Someone had a professional-looking camera with a lens the size of a small telescope. You know the type. The weather, was doing that very specific London thing where it can't decide. The sky was pale white, not quite overcast, not quite sunny, with a thin kind of light that made everything look slightly washed out. There was a breeze coming in off the park that smelled like cut grass and distant rain. My jacket wasn't quite warm enough, which Priya was delighted. This basically is so British, she kept saying, like that was the highest compliment she could give anything. And she wasn't wrong. There's something about that whole scene in the red tunics, the black bearskins, the absolute stillness of the men standing at their posts, that feels theatrical in a way that's somehow also completely sincere. Like a performance that has been running so long it stopped being a performance and became something else. Sort of ritual, maybe. Or memory made physical. We found a spot near the center of the railings. Not the best view, but decent enough. Priya had her phone out already. I'd my hands in my pockets and was trying to decide whether I wanted a coffee badly enough to leave and come back. That's when I basically first noticed him. He was at the far right of the guardsmen, maybe 30 feet from where we were standing. One of 4 posted along that stretch of the front gate. They all looked the same at a distance. Of course, that's almost the point, isn't it? The uniform is designed to make the individual disappear. You're not supposed to see a person. You're supposed to see an institution. But I noticed him because of his hands. They were down at his sides, the way they're supposed to be, perfectly correct. But, his fingers, the fingers on his right hand, were moving. Very slightly. Just the smallest tremor, like a thread in a breeze. So small that if he'd been standing where I was, at exactly that angle, with nothing else to look at yet, I never would have seen it. I didn't think much of it. Cold, maybe. Nerves. These men were human, after all, whatever the uniform suggested. In my opinion, the ceremony started. Plus, there was a band somewhere behind the gates, and that music began, that particular kind of brass-heavy, chest-expanding sound that seems to bounce off stone walls in a very satisfying way. The crowd pressed forward a little. Priya grabbed my arm with both hands and pointed her phone over the railing. And I kept watching the man on the right. His name, I found out much later, was Thomas Ellery. 23 years old, and from a small town in Shropshire that I genuinely never heard of. He joined the army at 18, been selected for the Household Cavalry 2 years later, and had been doing ceremonial duties for just over a year at the time. By every account I could find, he was good at it. Reliable. Disciplined. The kind of young man who took the job seriously. What actually, nobody knew, what Thomas himself had apparently tried very hard not to think about that morning, was that he hadn't slept in nearly 36 hours. Not because of negligence, not because of carelessness. His younger brother had been in a road accident 2 days before. Minor injuries, as it turned out, but those words, minor injuries, hadn't come until late the night before, after hours of not knowing, after hours of standing by a phone he couldn't answer and watching a clock he couldn't stop. He'd pretty much been told he could take leave. He'd said no. I don't know why he said no. Maybe he didn't feel like he had the right. Maybe the routine was the only thing keeping him steady. Maybe he, to be fair, was 23 and from a small town in Shropshire, and the Household Cavalry had been the biggest thing that had ever happened to him, and he didn't know how to let it down even when it would have understood completely. Whatever the reason, Thomas Ellery was standing at his post in front of Buckingham Palace. That morning, having barely eaten, barely slept, and carrying 36 hours of fear in his chest like a stone. And he was doing it perfectly. That's the thing that gets me when I think back. That's the thing that I keep coming back to. He was doing it perfectly. The ceremony had been going for maybe 15 minutes when the tone of the morning changed. There was a shift in the crowd, and, not dramatic, just a kind of collective refocusing, the way people move when something worth looking at has arrived. I heard it before I saw it, a low murmur that ran through the tourists and the school groups and the man with the telescope lens, a sound that was part recognition and part something harder to name. Then, I saw the car, a dark official vehicle, moving slowly along the road that runs inside the gates. And, beside it, visible through the railings, a figure in pale blue. Walking, not riding. Pausing to speak to someone in uniform. Moving with that particular quality of attention that some people have, that way of making whoever they're talking to feel, at least for those seconds, like the most important person in the space. I knew who it was before Priya said it. "Oh my God," she said, "and, is that—" "Yes," I said. The Princess of Wales was at an event that morning, something to do with a mental health initiative, a charity she'd been involved with for years. The palace was one of several stops, which it had been announced, technically, in the way these things are on official schedules that most people don't think to read. So the crowd hadn't been expecting her exactly, but, now that she was here, the recognition ran through everyone like a current. Cameras went up, which the murmur got louder. A few people near the front called out politely, the British way, which means warmly but, without losing your composure entirely. She paused near the gate. Spoke briefly to an aide. Looked out toward the crowd with that very specific expression. She's the one that manages to be both composed and genuine at the same time, which is much harder than it sounds. And Thomas Ellery, 30 feet to my right, was still standing perfectly still. Except his hands. That tremor I'd noticed before was worse, and subtle. You had to be looking for it. But his right hand was shaking now in a way that was no longer just a thread in a breeze. It was the whole flag. And his face, his face had gone a color I can only describe as not quite right. Not pale exactly. More like the color had been turned down. Like someone had adjusted a setting somewhere. I touched Priya's arm. "Watch the honestly, guard," I said, "which, the one on the far right?" She looked. We both looked, and, "He looks," she started. And then, he went down, and, not violently. That's the thing people get wrong when they hear this story secondhand. There was no drama to the falling itself. It wasn't like the movies, where someone staggers and catches themselves and staggers again. It was more like a slow, terrible certainty. His knees went first. Then, and I swear this is true, he made one visible, enormous effort to correct it. You could see it in his shoulders. The way he pulled himself back for just a fraction of a second. And then, the basically fraction ran out, and Thomas Ellery went down onto the stone in front of Buckingham Palace with a sound I can still hear if I think about it too hard. The crowd reacted in that particular way crowds do when something real interrupts something ceremonial. A sharp collective sort of intake of breath. Actually, a few short exclamations. Then, a strange, suspended silence, as though everyone had collectively decided to hold still until they understood what they were seeing. One of the other guardsmen had already moved. He broke position without hesitation, which, if you know anything about ceremonial duty, tells you everything about how seriously trained these men are in their actual function beneath the ceremony. He was at Thomas's side in seconds, one hand at his collar, one on his shoulder, voice low and steady. 3 other uniformed figures were moving from somewhere behind the gate. An officer, from the look of the insignia. And Kate Middleton, the Princess of Wales, who had been standing perhaps 50 feet away in the middle of a quiet exchange with an aide, had turned. She saw what happened, and I know she saw it because I was watching her face. And her face did something I wasn't expecting. It didn't do the composed, practiced thing. It didn't arrange itself into the appropriate expression of concern. It just reacted the way anyone's face reacts when they see someone fall. A brief, unguarded moment of pure human alarm. Her hand came up, not a gesture, just an instinct, the way your hand comes up when you see something you can't stop and wish you could. She was already moving toward the gate before her aide said a word. There's a protocol for everything at the palace. That's not a cliché, it's genuinely true. There are protocols for arrivals and departures, for greetings and dismissals, for how you approach, how you retreat, for what you say first and what you never say at all. The institution runs on protocol, the way an engine runs on oil. It keeps the parts from grinding against each other. And, yet, protocol, I've come to believe, has limits. And one of those limits is a 23-year-old in a bearskin hat who has just hit the cobblestones. What I saw in the next 60 seconds changed the way I think about a lot of things. The immediate response was fast and professional, the way it's supposed to be. The guardsman who had broken position was already on his knees beside Thomas, checking his pulse, speaking to him in low, urgent tones. The officer who'd come through the side gate was directing two others, one to manage the crowd side of the railings, one toward a communication point somewhere to the left. There were procedures being followed. Boxes being ticked. It was orderly. But Kate was already at the inner edge of the gate. She hadn't swept through dramatically. She hadn't called attention to herself. She'd simply closed the distance with that deliberate, quiet pace, the kind that says I'm not panicking, but I'm also not waiting. She'd stopped, to be fair, just inside the gate where a short flight of stone steps met the pavement, and she was watching Thomas with an expression that hadn't anything ceremonial in it at all. The aide beside her said something, and I couldn't hear it. She shook her head once, briefly. Then, she spoke to the officer. Again, I couldn't hear the words. None of us on the outside could, but the exchange was short, and there was a clarity to it. The kind of conversation where the hierarchy doesn't actually need to be stated because everyone already understands it. The officer nodded and stepped aside. She came down the steps. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is the part of the story where people who weren't there tend to fill in the gaps with what they wanted to see. I've read accounts online since then, some of them quite embellished, I think, where Kate kneels in the street, or holds Thomas's hand, or says something profound and quotable while the cameras roll. That's not quite what I saw. Plus, honestly, real life doesn't tend to arrange itself that neatly. What I actually saw was this: she came down the steps and stood close to where Thomas was being attended to, and she waited. That's the word for it, she waited. Not impatiently. Not with the energy of someone who wants to be noticed waiting. She just held the space. Like she understood that the people who were trained for this needed to do their work, and her job in that moment was simply not to be somewhere else. One of the medical staff, there was a small medical presence at any event of this kind, I later learned arrived with a kit bag. She stepped back to let them through without being asked. Thomas, by this point, was conscious. I could see that from where I stood. He was on his side, the bearskin hat lying on the stones a foot away, and he was answering questions. You could tell from the way his chest was moving, from the slight turn of his head. He was awakened, responding, and probably absolutely mortified. The crowd at the railings had gone very quiet. I noticed Priya had stopped filming. She'd lowered her phone at some point, I couldn't tell you exactly when, and she was just watching, the way I was watching, with that still, attentive quality people get when something real is happening in front of them and they've unconsciously decided that witnessing it matters more than recording it. There was a moment, and this is the part one think about most, this is the part I've turned over in my mind more times than I can count, where Thomas looked up. He was still on the ground, propped slightly now, one of the medical staff checking his blood pressure with that Velcro cuff that, sounds so absurdly ordinary in situations that aren't ordinary. He looked up honestly, maybe because someone spoke to him, maybe just because the light had changed slightly as a cloud moved, and he looked directly at her. I was too far away to see his expression clearly. I know that. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but from what I could make out, what crossed his face was not the expression of a soldier in the presence of a royal. It wasn't deference or formality or the automatic adjustment people make when hierarchy reasserts itself. It was something closer to the face a person makes when they've been holding something very heavy for a very long time and someone has just without making a production of it, put their hand under the weight. She said something to him. Short. Plus, he gave a very small nod. Then, she straightened, spoke briefly to the officer again, and walked back up the steps. For what it's worth, the ceremony continued. Or rather, it resumed, after a pause that felt longer than it probably was. Another sort of guardsman took the position Thomas had vacated. The band, somewhere behind the walls, had never actually stopped. The tourists pressed forward again, though with a different quality to their attention now, a slightly subdued sense of having witnessed something they hadn't come here for. The school group near me had a teacher at the front, a young woman who had shepherded all the children back from the railings with the careful efficiency of someone who had decided they didn't need to see a man on the ground. Now she was letting them come back, speaking to them in that particular calm voice adults use when they want to convey that everything is fine without quite lying. He fainted, she was explaining. Basically, it happens. They stand still for a very long time. It's actually very hard on the body. One of the children, couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, was looking very serious. Will he be okay? The child asked. Yes, the teacher said. He'll be okay. Priya turned to me. Her eyes were a little wet. She wasn't going to mention it, I could tell, so I didn't either. That was, she started. Yeah, I said. Plus, we stayed for another 20 minutes. The ceremony finished. The crowd dispersed in the slow, reluctant way crowds do when the thing they came to see is over, but nobody quite wants to be the first to admit it. A few people lingered at the railings, looking at the spot where Thomas had gone down as if the stones might tell them something. I lingered too, a little longer than made sense. I, for what it's worth, think I was waiting for something to resolve in my head. Some conclusion to arrive. The part of, in my opinion, the brain that processes events into meaning was still working, still turning the morning over. I wasn't quite ready to let the day get back to being ordinary. Because what I guess I'd seen, and this is hard to put into words without it sounding like more than it was a person trying very hard to be a symbol. Trying to hold well, himself to the standard the uniform demanded, even when he hadn't thing left to hold himself with. And I'd seen another person, a person who is, by most measures, as much a symbol as you can become. While still being a person, choose, in a very quiet and unremarkable way, to set the symbol down for a moment and just be present. And, somehow, without anyone making a speech about it or posting about it or performing it for the cameras, that mattered. I found the story online 3 days later. It had basically circulated, the way things do, blurry phone footage, a few still photographs taken through the railings, some of them close enough to make out details that I was too far away to see. The headlines were exactly what you'd expect: Princess stops for fallen guard. Royal shows compassion. Touching moment at the palace. They weren't wrong, exactly. But they also weren't quite right. Because the thing that actually moved me wasn't the optics of it. It wasn't the image of royalty pausing for a common soldier, though I understand why that's the story people want to tell. It was Thomas's hands. Plus, that tremor I'd noticed before anything happened. That small, private signal of a young man who had been carrying too much and hadn't told anyone and had shown up anyway. That is honestly the part that lived with me. That, is the part one couldn't stop thinking about. Because none of us in the crowd knew about his brother. None of us knew about the 36 hours. None of us knew what was actually going on behind that perfectly maintained, bearskin-topped stillness. We just, I think, saw a guard standing at his post. And he was doing it perfectly, right up until the moment he wasn't. There's a line I read once, I couldn't tell you where, I've never been able to find it again, about how the bravest thing a person can do is not the big gesture. Not the dramatic sacrifice. But the daily, invisible work of showing up to something that matters to you even when you're afraid, or exhausted, or quietly falling apart in ways nobody can see. I honestly don't know if Thomas Ellery would call what he did that morning brave. I suspect he'd say it was just his job. I suspect he'd be slightly embarrassed by this whole story, if he ever read it. But I was there. I saw his hands. And I think he was one of the bravest people I've ever watched do anything. I went back to the palace a week later. Not for any reason I could fully justify to myself. Priya had gone back to Edinburgh. Work had resumed, and the morning had filed itself away into memory the way mornings do, and life had continued with its usual indifference to the things that move you. But I went back. Plus, it was a Wednesday, overcast and cool, the kind of day where London feels like a city that's been slightly rinsed. I didn't go for the ceremony. I got there in the mid-morning quiet, when the main tourist push hadn't properly arrived yet, and stood at the railings for a while and looked at the stones. I don't know what I was expecting to find. Some residue, maybe, of what had happened. Plus, some visible mark that said here, something real occurred. Of course there was nothing, the stones were just stones. A pigeon TBH was doing that thing pigeons do where they walk in small determined circles as if they're about to accomplish something. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, feeling slightly foolish, and then, I bought a coffee from a cart near the park and sat on a bench and thought about why that morning had stayed with me the way it had. It wasn't about Kate Middleton, I decided. Or rather, it was, but not in the way the headlines made it. It wasn't about the grace of a royal or the optics of a touching moment or any of the things that make, to be fair, a story clippable and shareable and easy to feel good about for 30 seconds before you scroll to the next thing. It was about what she'd seen that most people hadn't. Because when Thomas went down, most of the crowd saw a guardsman fainting. An event. A thing that happened. Already being processed into a story to tell later. You'll never believe what we saw at Buckingham Palace. He just went down, right there, during the ceremony. But she'd been close enough, or perhaps paying a different kind of attention, to see what I'd seen. Not like the fall and the before. The holding on. The cost of the holding on. And she'd done something with that seeing, which was nothing dramatic. She just moved toward it. She just made sure someone was there. That's such a small thing. And it's such an enormous thing. I've thought, since then, about how many people we walk past every day who are doing what Thomas was doing. Holding themselves to a standard. Showing up to something that matters. Carrying something private and heavy and invisible in a chest that looks, from the outside, like it's managing perfectly well. The person in the queue at the coffee shop who's been awake all night with a sick parent. The colleague who laughs at the right moments in meetings and goes home to something they haven't told anyone about. The neighbor you wave to who waves back with the same smile they've had on their face for a year through things you'd be devastated to know. We're very good at holding ourselves together, humans. In my opinion, alarmingly good. The uniform doesn't have to be made of wool and brass buttons for it to be a uniform. And, mostly the tremor in the fingers goes unnoticed. There was a follow-up piece in one of the papers about 10 days after the event. Nothing major, a short human interest paragraph, the kind that runs on a slow news day, the kind most people read past. It said that the soldier had been treated, had been given leave, and was recovering. That for what it's worth, he was doing well, and it didn't name him, in keeping with some policy about private military personnel. It said he'd sent a brief message, relayed through a spokesperson, expressing embarrassment at the fuss and gratitude for the concern. Embarrassment at the fuss, which I sat with that for a while. He'd been awake for 36 hours. Plus, he'd held his post with his brother in a hospital and his hands shaking. He'd gone down on the stones of Buckingham Palace in front of several hundred tourists and a member of the royal family. And his first instinct, when the world noticed, was to apologize for making a scene. I wanted to find Thomas Ellery very much in that moment. I wanted to sit across a table from him in whatever small-town Shropshire pub he probably drank in and say, "Mate, none of that was fuss. None of that was embarrassing. You held on for as long as any human being could hold, and, when you couldn't anymore, people helped you, and that's exactly how it's supposed to work." But you can't tell a 23-year-old who takes the job seriously that the job doesn't matter as much as he thinks it does in a way that they'll believe. They have to arrive at that themselves. I suspect he's, over time. Plus, these things tend to shift when the adrenaline stops and the brother goes home from the hospital and life reassembles itself into something manageable. I hope he knows. Priya called me a few weeks later. She'd seen the story online, not the brief paper piece. One of, in my opinion, the longer blog posts that had spread around, written by someone else who'd been in the crowd that morning. It was a good piece, actually. Better than mine would have been. It captured something true about the day. Did I think, you see this, she said. I did. I've been thinking about it, she said. About him, I think, just showing up like that, and, when he had every reason not to. I know. Do you think she knew what he was dealing with? I thought about it. The truth is, I don't know, there's no way to know. Maybe she sort of asked afterward and was told. Maybe she sensed something in the moment and it informed how she approached it. Maybe it was entirely routine for her, a moment of human decency that she's repeated hundreds of times in contexts both visible and invisible, and the only reason this one became a story is that someone happened to be watching with their phone out. I don't think pretty much it matters, I said, eventually. Whether she knew the details. What do you mean? I mean, she saw someone struggling and moved toward it instead of away from it. In my opinion, that's the thing. I think that's the whole thing. You don't have to know every detail of someone's story to choose to be present in it. A pause on the line. That's annoyingly wise, Priya said. The thing about the changing of the guard that I'd always found slightly hollow, before that day, the ceremony of it, the careful pageantry, the polished performance of something that was once practical and is now entirely symbolic, is that I never quite understood what it was actually for. I think I understand it now, a little better. It's not for the tourists. Or not only for the tourists. It's a visible, daily enactment of continuity. Pretty much, of showing up. Of the commitment, however costly, to be where you said you would be. There's something in it that's almost obstinate, this absolute insistence on the routine, on the standard, on the proper way of doing the thing regardless of what's happening around it or inside the people doing it. And that can be its own kind of tyranny, the insistence on the standard above all. I'm not pretending otherwise. Thomas Ellery probably should have taken the leave he was offered. His commanding officers would have understood, no one would have thought less of him. But, the part of me that watched his hands shake for 15 minutes before he finally fell, the part of me that watched him make that one last visible effort to hold himself upright, that part doesn't feel criticism toward him. It feels something else. Something without a precise English name, though I've a feeling that certain other languages might have one. The ache of recognizing, in someone you've never met and will never speak to, something of yourself. Some echo of the private maintenance work you've done, are doing, will do. Some chord played in a key, you know. I walked home from that bench by the palace the second time I visited. It was a long walk, the better part of an hour, and I probably should have taken the tube. But the afternoon was gray and quiet in a companionable sort of way, and I wanted the time. I walked along the south side of the park, past the lake where the pelicans live, past the bandstand, out toward Vauxhall and, then, along the river a little way. The Thames was doing its tidal thing, low and brown and smelling of itself, which is a smell you either find romantic or you don't, and I've lived here long enough that I find it romantic. I thought about Thomas. I thought about the woman in blue who'd come down the steps. I thought, to be fair, about the school group teacher explaining to a 9-year-old that the guard would be okay, that standing still for a very long time was simply hard on the body. I thought about my own stone on my own chest, that particular Tuesday, which was not dramatic or special and which I'm not going to tell you about because this story is not about me, not really, but which was there, the way it's always there for everyone, in one form or another. And I thought, how many people today are doing what Thomas did? Standing at their post. Showing up to the thing. Hands shaking where no one can quite see. Here is what I know now that I didn't know when I woke up that Tuesday morning. The uniform is not the courage. The courage is under the uniform. The ceremony is not the dedication. The dedication, pretty much, is what happens when there's no ceremony left. And the most dignified thing one person can do for another, the quietest, the most human, the one that requires nothing but attention and the willingness to act on what you see, is to simply move toward them when they fall. Not to make it into something. Not to perform the caring. Not to post the moment or frame it or narrate it in a way that puts you at the center of the story. Just to close the distance. Like, just to be there. That's what I watched happen on a pale Tuesday morning in early June, with Priya's hand on my arm and a school group hushed at the railings, in front of a gate that has stood for hundreds of years and will stand for hundreds more, through every ceremony and every breaking down and every private trembling hand and every person who shows up anyway. Just to be there, it's such a small thing. It's everything.